Hi everyone, today's video is about the depth of field, and I will be saying what it is and what aspects affect the depth of field and what determines the look and how to determine the right depth of field to use when you're shooting or taking photographs. So what is it? So basically, for many cameras, the distance between the nearest and farthest objects that are acceptably sharp focus in an image. So it's basically the back. Mostly what happens. It's mostly about distance. So that's what determines the depth of field most of the time, and how the image looks when you make adjustments to the image. And the depth of field can be calculated based on the focal length, the distance to the subject, the acceptable circle of confusion size. So that is we're not going to get into that. But I think it's basically about the sensor itself, which I have included, so and the aperture. But there is a formula for that. How to for the depth of field, how to calculate it. But we won't I won't get into that. You can look that up yourself. So because it's on Google and you could type on Google search the formula, so and it will give you the formula. So a particular depth field may be chosen for technical or artistic purposes. So basically, there's a reason why you choose depth field that you've chosen for your image. So when you take a photo, you're doing it for one reason or another. So yeah, and the limitations of depth field can sometimes be overcome with various techniques and equipment. So basically, if you are limited with certain equipment and stuff, it's going to be harder for you to get the depth of field right. But it's not possible. It's not impossible to get the right depth of field that you need to determine what shot is what, basically, because you need to have a you want your photo to look good, so you have to get it right, basically, and you have to make sure that you're always checking and doing things. You like mostly in general, you need to check what's the right depth of field, what will be good, and what looks aesthetically pleasing to the pleasure of the audience eyes, basically. And that's why using different equipment, like you can for example, you can use lighting, or you could change the focus a bit. That's what you can do. Or you can, some people edit through certain software like Adobe Lightroom, for example. But I don't think that will help with the depth field really. So basically, these are images. So the first image is how deep. If when the depth of field is deep, that means the whole background and the subject itself is actually in focus. So the main subject is in focus, so is the background. And there is a type of focus for it. I've done it already. I've done a video already. And I'm trying to remember the name of it. I think it's called the deep focus. It's called deep focus that's because nothing, you don't really know what's the center. You don't know what to draw to. So that's why and they changed the focus of it. That's how you get the shallow depth of field, because they changed the focus, meaning that you're able to focus on the subject more easily, because you know the main subject is the most important, and the background is just excluded because it's been blurred out. So and the second image is just mostly about narrows, and there's certain aspects that affects like the distance and the length, the focal length, which will determine the depth of field really, which I'll get into in a while. So, and there's more images as well. So these are just depth field affects the lenses, like so the apps we know that the shallow depth field is the smaller, the wider lens, and the deeper depth field is more the smaller. So it gets smaller each time. So you can see this image as well, like it's out of focus and the other one's in focus. So we know what to focus on because it changes each time. And here is just a graph that shows you how the camera works you're using when you are determining what depth of field it is and how to get it, and and it's just inside the lens and what it does to create that depth of field. We're not necessarily saying it was far or close or anything like that. It's just a diagram of how the camera works when you are getting the depth of fields that you want. So facts that affect the depth of field. So aperture is the opening of the lens, which I've already covered. And if you still want the link to it, you might as well message me about that. It's the opening of the lens to allow light to pass through the camera's sensor. So that will determine, so that will expand in size to make more light pass through the lens. And the smaller it gets, the less light that could come through. And if the photographer wants to adjust the depth of field, so the first thing they think of when doing that is the aperture, because the aperture is kind of what it is the basically the what do you call it, how to that's how you're going to get the focus, and you're going to get how bright or how dark the photo will be, because that could affect some it does affect the depth of field when it's in terms of the lighting as well. And large apertures correlate to small f-stops, meaning that there is a shallow depth of field, while the small apertures correlate larger f-stops, meaning they produce images with a larger depth of field. So I have some images here. So as we all know, the small f-stop, which is the small aperture, meaning there's a deep depth of field, meaning that you can see the background, everything's in focus. There's nothing that's blurring them. And small f stop, meaning the large aperture, is the shallow depth of field. And same with the second image, and there's two comparisons to it in terms of how the aperture affects the depth of field. And we all know now what that is through this aperture scale based on the numbers. So we all have. Just it does mean large apertures are fast apertures as well, and wide apertures. And just and when it's closed, it means that it's slow, and meaning that light could travel at a slow speed. And this, this the less that feels more light, meaning there is a chance that light don't goes in really quickly, and it does impact the way the photo looks. So focal length, so wide angle lens, also known as a short focal lens. I've already done a video on lenses as well, if you want to look at that video too. I'll leave a link to both videos anyway, so have deep depth fields than telephoto lens, which is also known as long focal lens. I think the telephoto lens kind of is very small and it doesn't do much with the aperture and the focus and stuff. So it doesn't mean that. That's not what it means. Basically, it's much more complicated in terms of how the depth field is affected. The focal length affects the depth field. But when you take an image and you don't make a change, the statement up above it, which is the camera subject distance, doesn't change. But you make changes, but you don't do anything to it hardly, because you already got what you want. The type of depth field. I have the image already. I got the reference from this website about it. I will leave link. It's in the link. I will leave the links in the comments. It's called Photography Live. I can't remember. And they were saying it's more complicated than that. And there's so many factors that you could do to get the focal length right in order for the depth of field, for the required depth of field to be met. So this allows the user to capture the wider depth of field. So the longer or more zoomed the camera lens, the less depth of field you capture. So as I said, that the telephoto lens is quite zoomed in terms of the lens size and the distance that it could go to zoom in. And when you and it means that you can't get a lot of depth of field in. So it creates something completely different. And I think it makes the black background more blurry. And so the focal length for this one, the second image I'm talking about, is 85 millimeters. And the focal length for the first one is 50 millimeters. But the aperture stays the same, it doesn't change. But if you change the aperture, it'll become a totally different image. So depth field is shallow, producing heavy background blur. And that's the same with the second one, but it's even more blurred. So the background's almost non-existent. You can't see anything because everything in that background, all the images that are behind it, is quite blurry. So that's the reason is because of the focal length has changed and not the aperture itself. which most photographers would say that. But if you change the aperture, it might become a different image, as I just mentioned. And this is basically an example, like from the website, how each time you change the distance, the focal length, and the depth of field, in terms of what adjustments you made to create the depth of field through the use of the focal length. But it depends on the camera, really, because if you have to use a different make of camera, because some lenses are very different. They're all very different in their own way, how they allow things to be focused, how the image looks, the maximum zoom length and the minimum zoom length, where it can create a wide or close up. It affects every part of it. Distance, so the important factor which determines the depth of field is the distance between the camera and the subject that's in the camera. So the closer you are with the camera, let's say, is to the subject, the more it's in, the narrower the depth of field will be. So inversely, it says the further away it is, and the wider the depth of field will be. So that will constitute to the length of the frame and stuff. And cameras, and that's what how it happens. So if you're like this, it depends how close you are. But some people would use zoom to achieve that. But zoom doesn't all. But I would use zoom because you're setting up for a close up. If you're doing a close up, I would use the zoom setting because you want it to be more smooth and you want it to look good. And it can help you set up for the shop more easily and stuff. So I just zoom in before I press record, so I know how long I want. So I don't have to move forward just to get as close up. But you could, but rather for me. But it's good if you move forward as well. So I do that as well. It's not just about zooming in all the time. Because some people use it as a safe option, but it's not gonna. Sometimes it makes a photo look freaking weird. I would say, or it just doesn't look right. And she's like 2 inches away from the camera, which the closer she is, so basically it blurs everything in the background. It's shallow when she's close, and when she's farther back, she's more in within the background. So it's more even when the depth of field, the focal distance is more further away. So it's around. It's basically what that first image is trying to tell you, the one on the top, because the distance you are, the further you are, and the more sharpness you're going to get from the image. And it goes the same here with the second one. Because if you make alterations, it could change the aspect of the photo. It could change the way it is. So altering the distance for framing equivalence and aperture for depth of field equivalence using a 50mm lens. That's just an example. So it depends on the lens as well. This is why it's complicated to explain the depth of field. I think it determines what the depth of field is. The sensor size affects the depth of field. So basically, it just basically the cameras that have smaller sensors have a larger depth of field. However, if you need to be careful on how you make the comparison because you must look at the lens the same way you look at the focal length so that the view fields of view are the same. So it that's why it was difficult to explain the focal length because of it, the sensor size, and it depends on the make of your camera as well because things could look different as well, and it depends on the distance that your camera can go up to and the lens. Because you have to change the lens as well to get the right length and stuff, the focal length, and to get the right depth of field as well. And if you shoot at the same camera subject distance with the same apertures, you will find that the larger sensors will have a shallower depth of field. Because if you keep it the same, let's say if you, because if you let's say if you are trying to go for a deeper depth of field, you must make changes to it, like maybe the aperture, or because the aperture you can make it more smaller so you can get the best depth of field get. You can get a deeper depth of field, and that's why professional portrait photographers like to use full frame cameras because they can achieve the shot they want to achieve. And here you go, like there is like 120 millimeter on full frame camera. So it's the same depth aperture, but what changed was the sensor size. So you can get problem with the 120 is more, it's a bit more shadowy and has a shallow depth field, whereas the 75 millimeter one with a different camera make with a 1.6 crop camera is more in focus, and these are the crop factors as well in terms of the size of the sensor. And there's the sensor size, and we all know now that the larger depth field makes the image more in focus and the smaller one doesn't. And there you go, there's more about that as well. As I said, there's I'll leave you to take a look at that. Yeah, and then you can see that every aspect, how it constitutes to the size, how the depth feels that you're aiming to achieve or aiming for. So large apertures meaning subject's focus close, longer focal length and large aperture sensor size, and smaller ones the opposite. And that's how you achieve shallower and deeper depth of fields. And what determines the depth of field? So many DSLR cameras have a deep pre- of depth field preview button, pardon me. So if you press this button while you look through the viewfinder, the camera will stop down the lens and you will see the actual image it will look, how the actual image will look. So, however, at small apertures, the viewfinder could get very dark and it will be hard to see the preview because you didn't put settings in terms of what you want to put and how you're going to make the image more viewable and easy to see and basically pleasing to the eye and more viewer friendly, I would say. And like view, live view can also be used for some camera models to preview how depth of field will look. So you just need to check your instruction manual to see if your DSLR could do that. And mirrorless shooters potentially have an advantage over DSLR shooters because what they see through the viewfinder or on the LCD is how the photo will typically look, which will look more different. It might look better, actually, because DSLRs are very, very. I just hate those cameras mostly because. But I think they're the best cameras to start out if you're kind of new to photography and you don't know much about shooting. But it's very, very restrictive in terms of the shallow. It's so shallow you have to, and it's very small in terms of the size of the lens and all that and everything about it. It's just I always get frustrated using those cameras anyway. So when filming as well, it's kind of difficult as well because you're trying to find the right focus, but it seemingly changes. Even with press manual, you just have to get it so right, and you have to make sure the shot is not blurry. And it happened to me. That's why we had a problem with the camera, and we kept complaining to my teacher about it on my first when I was on set for my film, but it didn't work out. And that's why you should learn about these things. Learning is basically the only thing you can do to get things right and to never make many mistakes like it. But I will still make mistakes, but it'll be less subtle. It'll be more subtle than how I did. It has to be less obvious that you made a mistake. So that's what you get from filming. It doesn't matter if you make a mistake in filmmaking. You will improve. You have the opportunity to improve. And you need to practice as well. Your trade, practice going on set, practice filming on your phone and using I don't want to say this because I hated using it's a bit similar to Filmic Pro if you know what that is. And there's other ones. I can't remember the app I used, but it's kind of similar to Filmic Pro. It was because you can achieve a 4K shot, 4K image, resolution image. So, and it was very rubbish. It was so shit. I just couldn't even. The settings were so limited. I couldn't do much with it. So, and all I could do is change the white balance, change the focus, but I couldn't really change the focus too much, and I couldn't change the depth of field in the frame when I was filming. So I did want to get the film right as well, and the composition right as well, everything about it, because I was apparently going to submit it for festival, but I ended up not doing it. It was a very short film. It was only like it's a micro short film, in fact, and I didn't. I decided the shot wasn't good enough, for it to be entered to a festival where there's this festival called DePict. I'll leave a link for DePict if you want to enter your film or check out the website for you to enter for festivals. So here are the references for the video, and I'll leave more references as well, such as the DePict Film Festival where you could submit micro short films. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and please like, share and subscribe to this channel. I know this video is long, but it's important regardless whether you like it or not for your filmmaking career, or if you're already in the filmmaking industry. Yeah. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.